Story number 1. The Basement of Shadows. Karen had just started her new job as a night shift custodian at a large office building downtown. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid well, and the quietness of the late hours suited her. Plus, the building was mostly empty at night, except for a few floors with 24/7 workers, so she was free to go about her routine without much interruption. By her third week, Karen had grown comfortable with the eerie silence of the empty hallways. She had a system: start at the top floor, work her way down, and finish in the basement. The basement was her least favorite place. It was an old, dimly lit storage area, far older than the rest of the sleek, modern building. The air there was heavy, the lighting sparse, and the shadows seemed to cling to the walls as if the darkness itself was alive. It was around 1 a.m. when Karen made her way to the basement for her final task of the night, cleaning out the storage rooms. As she descended the stairs, the air grew colder, a noticeable drop from the rest of the building. The basement had always felt colder, but tonight it was almost unbearable. The fluorescent lights overhead flickered, their soft buzzing filling the quiet space as she reached the bottom. Her footsteps echoed unnaturally in the narrow hallway as she passed rows of old, unused office furniture and filing cabinets that hadn't been touched in years. She reached the main storage room and began sweeping, her thoughts wandering as the rhythmic motions of her broom scraped across the floor. Suddenly, the lights flickered again, more violently this time, plunging her into near darkness for a moment before sputtering back to life. Karen stopped, staring at the long, shadowed hallway that led to the exit. It was empty, at least she thought it was. She could have sworn she saw movement, just a flicker of something in her peripheral vision, at the far end of the corridor. A shadow that didn't quite match the rest of the dim space. Shaking it off as her imagination, she returned to her task, but the uneasy feeling lingered. The basement was always creepy, but tonight felt different. After a few more minutes, Karen heard a noise. A soft shuffling, like footsteps dragging across the concrete floor. She froze, her heart beginning to race. "Hello," she called out, her voice breaking the heavy silence. No answer. The sound stopped, and the building felt oppressively still again, the silence now more unsettling than before. She waited, straining her ears, but heard nothing. Swallowing her unease, she decided it was probably an animal, a rat or something, but even as she tried to convince herself, a prickling sensation crept up her spine. Returning to the broom, she moved faster now, wanting to get out of the basement as quickly as possible, but then she heard it again. This time, closer. The same slow, dragging footsteps, coming from just around the corner behind her. Karen's breath hitched. She spun around, her heart pounding in her chest. The hallway was empty, but she knew she wasn't alone. She grabbed her flashlight from her cleaning cart, clicking it on and aiming it down the dark corridor. The beam cut through the gloom, illuminating the old brick walls and stacks of forgotten office supplies. But at the far end of the hallway, something was wrong. The light seemed to bend, unable to fully penetrate the farthest corner, as if something was absorbing it. "Who's there?" she demanded, her voice trembling slightly. And then she saw it. The darkness at the end of the hallway shifted, not like a shadow cast by the flickering lights, but as if it was moving independently, something standing there, watching her. It wasn't a figure she could describe, more like a black mass, darker than the shadows around it, almost liquid in form. Its outline wavered, flickering in and out with the sputtering lights. Her stomach lurched as a cold wave of fear washed over her. She took a step back, her hand instinctively gripping the handle of the broom, a weapon. But before she could react, the thing began to move. Slowly, deliberately, it slid toward her, dragging itself across the floor without a sound. Its presence felt wrong, like it didn't belong to the physical world at all. Panic surged through her. She turned and sprinted toward the exit, her heart hammering in her chest. Behind her, the lights began to flicker more violently, popping and dimming in rapid succession. She didn't dare look back, but she could hear it now, the unmistakable sound of something following her. That same dragging sound, but faster now, like it was closing in. Karen reached the stairwell door and shoved it open with trembling hands. The stairwell was dark, the emergency lights barely working, casting a sickly red glow over everything. She raced up the stairs, 2 at a time, her legs burning with effort, but she couldn't stop. The cold, oppressive feeling chased her, thickening the air around her like a blanket of dread. When she finally burst through the door at the top of the stairs, she slammed it shut behind her, locking it with shaking fingers. For a moment, she stood there, gasping for breath, her back pressed against the door. The quiet hum of the office building above felt unreal after the terror she'd just escaped. But then she noticed the lights in the hallway flickering, just like they had in the basement. Her heart sank. Slowly, she turned, dreading what she might see. The stairwell door was now open, just a crack. From the darkness beyond, a shadow stretched into the hallway, long, unnatural, unwaiting. Karen didn't wait to see what would come through the door. She ran, her footsteps echoing down the empty halls, knowing that whatever was in the basement had followed her and it wasn't done yet. Story number 2. The Whispering Warehouse. Tim had worked the night shift at the old industrial warehouse for almost a year. The job was easy, just keep an eye on the place, do a few rounds, and make sure nothing was out of place. It was quiet work, perfect for a guy like him, who didn't mind being alone. The warehouse itself was massive, a relic from the 1950s, filled with rows upon rows of rusted machinery and old crates that hadn't been touched in years. The only thing that ever bothered Tim was the size of the place. It was easy to get lost if you didn't know your way around, and in the dead of night, the long, empty corridors and towering shelves could feel suffocating. He'd often hear the building creak and groan as it settled, or a distant clang as something shifted in the dark. At first, it unnerved him, but after months on the job, he'd grown used to the noises. At least, he thought he had. One night, around 2 a.m., the power cut out. The hum of the overhead lights vanished, plunging the entire warehouse into thick, suffocating darkness. Tim wasn't worried at first. Power outages were common in the old building. The backup generator would usually kick in within a minute or two. But as the seconds ticked by, and the only sound was his own breathing, a creeping sense of unease began to worm its way into his chest. Tim pulled out his flashlight and clicked it on. The weak beam barely cut through the darkness, illuminating only the nearest rows of crates and machinery. He reached for his radio to check in with the night supervisor, but heard nothing but static on the other end. The power must have knocked out the signal. Grumbling, he decided to make his rounds early and check on the generator in the back. He made his way down the narrow corridors, the light from his flashlight bouncing off the walls as he walked. The farther he went, the more uneasy he felt. The usual creaks and groans of the building were absent, replaced by an oppressive silence that pressed down on him like a weight. Every footstep seemed loud, echoing unnaturally in the still air. As he passed by a long row of crates, he heard something faint, almost imperceptible at first. It sounded like whispering. Tim froze, turning his flashlight toward the direction of the noise. The light fell on a distant corner of the warehouse, barely visible in the beam's reach. The whispering continued, too quiet to make out any words, but persistent. His pulse quickened. He called out, "Hello, anyone there?" The whispering stopped instantly. Tim waited, straining his ears. The silence was overwhelming. After a few tense moments, he shook his head, telling himself it was probably just the wind outside or the building settling. But something about it didn't sit right with him. He decided to move faster, eager to check on the generator and get back to the control room. He was halfway through the warehouse when the whispering started again, this time, much closer. Tim spun around, sweeping his flashlight across the rows of crates and machinery. There was nothing there, but the whispering was louder now, like a voice just out of reach, breathing softly against his ear. His heart pounded in his chest as he quickened his pace, the beam of his flashlight shaking in his hand. As he neared the generator room, he felt a sudden drop in temperature. The air around him grew icy cold, enough to make his breath come out in visible puffs. He stopped, shining his light ahead. The door to the generator room was slightly ajar, which was strange. He was sure it had been closed when he last checked. Taking a deep breath, Tim stepped forward and pushed the door open. The generator was there, motionless, its usual hum absent. But that wasn't what caught his attention. On the far wall, just beyond the reach of his flashlight, something was scrawled in large, smeared letters. Tim stepped closer, his breath catching in his throat as he read the words, "Leave now." The writing looked fresh, dripping slightly, as though it had just been painted. His mind raced. No one else should be here. He turned around, heart hammering in his chest, fully intending to head back to the entrance and call for help. But then, the door slammed shut behind him. He ran to the door, grabbing the handle and pulling with all his strength. It wouldn't budge. His flashlight flickered, casting brief shadows across the room. And then he heard it again, the whispering, directly behind him. Tim spun around, his back pressed to the door, shining the light frantically into the room. The whispering grew louder, more distinct. It wasn't just a single voice anymore, it sounded like dozens of voices, all murmuring in unison, their words overlapping in a frantic, dissonant chorus. In the middle of the room, something moved. Tim's flashlight flickered again, and for a split second, he saw it, an indistinct shape, dark and twisted, standing in the center of the room. It didn't move like a person. Its limbs jerked unnaturally, its head tilted at an odd angle. The whispering grew louder, more urgent, as the figure started to inch toward him. Panicking, Tim banged on the door, desperate to get out, his flashlight now completely dead. The cold in the room intensified, biting at his skin. The whispers were deafening now, swirling around him like a storm. Suddenly, the door burst open behind him, and he fell backward into the hallway. He scrambled to his feet, glancing back into the room, but the figure was gone. The whispering had stopped. Without a second thought, Tim ran through the warehouse, not stopping until he reached the entrance. The power flickered back on, just as he stumbled outside, collapsing onto the pavement, gasping for air. He never went back to that warehouse. The next day, when his supervisor asked why he quit so suddenly, Tim could only say one thing: there's something in there, and it doesn't want us around. Story number 3. The Late Night Caller. Sam had been working the night shift as a security guard at the local call center for about 6 months. It wasn't a bad gig, mostly quiet, just him and a few workers who handled emergency customer service calls for international clients. The building itself was a bit eerie at night. During the day, it was bustling with people, but once the sun went down, the place felt different, hollow, like something was watching from the shadows. His routine was simple: a few rounds around the office, check the cameras, make sure everything was locked up. Most nights, he didn't mind it. He'd pop in his headphones, listen to a podcast, and the hours would pass quickly. But tonight felt off from the moment he clocked in. There was a strange tension in the air, like the building was holding its breath. Around 1:30 a.m., as Sam was sitting in the security office, watching the cameras, something caught his eye. The screen for the third-floor break room flickered. It wasn't unusual for the cameras to glitch. It was an old system, but when it cleared up, he saw something that made his skin crawl. A figure, standing by the vending machine. He leaned closer, narrowing his eyes at the monitor. It wasn't one of the workers. There were only 2 people on the night shift, and they both stayed on the first floor. This person was standing unnaturally still, facing the wall, just out of the camera's full view. The figure didn't move, didn't grab anything from the machine, just stood there. Sam felt a chill run down his spine. Must be someone from another department, he muttered, trying to shake off the unease. But something about the figure's posture seemed wrong, off-kilter, like it wasn't human. He decided to check it out. Grabbing his flashlight, he made his way up the stairs to the 3rd floor. The sound of his footsteps echoed through the empty stairwell, the only sound breaking the thick silence. When he reached the 3rd floor door, he hesitated. A strange sensation crawled over his skin, as if the air around him had suddenly grown colder. He shrugged it off and pushed the door open. The hallway was dimly lit, the fluorescent lights flickering overhead. He walked toward the break room, flashlight in hand, but when he arrived, the room was empty. No one by the vending machine. No sign of movement at all. Sam checked the time on his phone. 1:43 a.m. Maybe the camera had glitched again. Or maybe he'd just been seeing things. He let out a breath. He didn't realize he'd been holding and started back toward the stairs. But just as he was about to open the stairwell door, he heard its footsteps. They weren't his own. They were soft but distinct, coming from the direction of the break room. He turned slowly, shining his flashlight back down the hallway. There, at the far end of the hall, just past the glow of the flickering lights, was the figure. This time, it was facing him. Sam's heart skipped a beat. The figure didn't move, didn't react to the light. Its face was obscured in shadow, but the way it stood completely still, arms hanging awkwardly at its sides, sent a wave of dread through him. "Hey," Sam called out, trying to sound authoritative, though his voice wavered. "You're not supposed to be here. Who are you?" No response. The figure remained frozen in place, almost like a statue. Sam's stomach churned. Every instinct in his body told him to leave, to get back downstairs, but he couldn't look away. He took a step forward, then another. That's when the lights above him went out completely. Panic surged through him. The hallway was plunged into darkness, the only light coming from his flickering flashlight. Sam whipped the beam around, scanning the corridor, but the figure was gone. His breath came in short, rapid bursts as he backed up toward the stairwell door. His hand fumbled for the handle, but just as he grabbed it, he heard a whisper. A faint, almost imperceptible voice, coming from directly behind him. "Help me." Sam spun around, his flashlight shaking in his hand. There was nothing there, no one in the hall. But the voice had been so close, like someone was standing right over his shoulder. He threw open the stairwell door and rushed down the stairs, not stopping until he was back in the safety of the security office. His heart was pounding, his skin cold and clammy. He checked the cameras again, but everything seemed normal. No sign of the figure anywhere. Sam sank into his chair, trying to steady his breathing. He told himself it was just his mind playing tricks on him. He'd been working too many night shifts, spending too much time alone. That had to be it. But as the minutes ticked by, the unease in his chest wouldn't go away. He kept glancing at the camera feed, expecting to see the figure again. Every little sound, the hum of the lights, the creak of the building, put him on edge. At around 3 a.m., his radio crackled to life. It was one of the night shift workers downstairs. "Sam, is everything okay up there?" the voice asked. Sam grabbed the radio, trying to keep his voice steady. "Yeah, why?" There was a pause on the other end, before the worker spoke again, his voice sounding uncertain. "I thought I saw someone standing by the elevator, but when I got closer, they were gone." Sam's blood ran cold. He quickly switched to the camera that showed the elevator on the first floor. For a moment, everything seemed normal. But then, as the camera flickered again, he saw it, the figure, standing just outside the elevator, staring straight at the camera, as if it knew he was watching. Sam's heart pounded in his chest, as the figure slowly lifted a hand and pointed directly at him. The feed cut out. In that moment, Sam realized something chilling. This wasn't someone from another department, and this wasn't a trick of his mind. Whatever that thing was, it had followed him. and it was getting closer. He wasn't alone in the building anymore.